Have you ever felt like your life keeps getting pulled in the wrong direction by thoughts you never consciously chose? Thoughts that make you doubt yourself, fear the future, replay the past, and turn a small moment into a heavy day. That is where so much suffering begins. Not outside you, but inside the mind, where one unchecked thought becomes emotion, emotion becomes action, and action quietly becomes a life you keep repeating. This is why learning to control your thoughts can change everything. Not by forcing yourself to be positive, and not by pretending pain is not real, but by understanding how the mind works, how old patterns keep running, and how to stop giving every thought the power to shape your identity and your future. Because once you learn to take back control of your inner world, your outer life begins to change with it. And the first thing you must understand is this. 1. You are not your thoughts. One of the biggest mistakes you can make is treating every thought in your mind like a message from the truth. Because the mind speaks constantly, and it does not only speak from wisdom, it also speaks from fear, from memory, from old shame, from stress, from comparison, from exhaustion, and from wounds that still haven't fully healed. So when a thought says, "You are not enough," or "You always ruin things," or "Nothing will change," the real danger is not that the thought appeared. The real danger is that you believed it so quickly that it became part of your identity before you even stopped to question it. That is where suffering grows, not because the mind produced something negative, but because you stepped inside it too fast. You let one sentence become your mood become your behavior, and your behavior become another day that looks exactly like the old life you say you want to leave behind. But the turning point is simple and powerful. The thought is not you. If you can notice it, then there is already something deeper than it inside you. There is an awareness that can watch it, name it, and decide whether it deserves your attention. That awareness is where your power begins. Because the moment you stop saying, "This is me," and start saying, "This is a thought passing through me," you create space. And that space is everything. A fearful thought can still appear, but it does not get to become your future automatically. A harsh thought can still appear, but it does not get to define your worth. A hopeless thought can still appear, but it does not get to speak like a king inside your mind just because it arrived with emotion. This is what changes a life, not the absence of negative thoughts, but the end of blind obedience to them. You do not need to wrestle every thought to the ground. You do not need to panic when something dark, insecure, or limiting appears. You only need to stop giving instant loyalty to whatever your mind says first. Because the first thought is often conditioning. It is often an old pattern. It is often the voice of habit, not the voice of truth. So the practice becomes very clear. When a thought hits, do not enter it immediately. Pause, notice it. Name it. That is fear. That is comparison. That is self-judgment. That is an old story. The moment you name it, you weaken its spell. The moment you see it clearly, you stop letting it move through you like fate. And that is the real beginning of mental freedom. You are no longer trapped inside every mental storm. You are no longer forced to become every voice that passes through your head. You can stay still while the thought moves. You can let it speak without letting it lead. You can choose again. That choice may look small in the moment, but it changes more than you think. Because when you stop identifying with every fearful thought, you stop building your life around fear. When you stop identifying with every limiting thought, you stop shrinking to match it. And when you stop identifying with every painful thought, you finally make room for a different inner life to begin. So remember this, the next time your mind turns against you, a thought can visit you without becoming you. And the more deeply you understand that, the less power your old mind has to keep creating your old life. And if this point spoke to something real in you, take 1 second to like the video and write in the comments, "I am not my thoughts." 2. Your mind is running old programming. Sometimes nothing serious has happened, and yet your mind reacts as if it already knows how the story ends. A message comes in late, and you feel ignored. Someone's tone changes, and you feel judged. One mistake happens, and your mind jumps straight to, "Here we go again." That jump is the important part, because it reveals something most people never stop to examine. A lot of your thinking is not fresh thinking. It is old programming running on cue. That is why certain thoughts feel so immediate. They are rehearsed. They have traveled the same road so many times that the mind no longer treats them like possibilities. It treats them like facts. The reaction feels natural, even personal, but often it is just familiar. A script. A pattern your system learned earlier and kept repeating because repetition always becomes easier than reflection. This is how people end up living inside thoughts they never consciously chose. The mind keeps offering the same interpretations. I am behind. People always leave. I have to prove myself. Nothing is safe unless I control it. If something feels uncertain, it must be bad. And because those thoughts have been practiced for years, they arrive with authority. They sound like truth, when in reality they are often just old conclusions that were never challenged enough to lose power. Some of this programming came from pain, some from shame, some from environments that trained you to stay alert, guarded, or hard on yourself, some from repetition alone. It doesn't always matter where it started first. What matters is that you begin seeing it clearly now, because what stays invisible keeps running your life without permission. This is why change feels harder than people expect. They think they are trying to build a new life with a neutral mind, but they are not. They are trying to build a new life while an old inner system keeps whispering familiar instructions. Stay small. Expect disappointment. Assume the worst. Doubt yourself first. Protect yourself before anything even happens. If you do not see that system, you will keep calling its voice me. But it is not all you. A repeated thought is not proof. A familiar thought is not wisdom. And a thought that has visited you for years does not become sacred just because it knows the way back into your head. The first real shift happens when you stop asking only, "Is this thought true?" and begin asking, "Why does my mind keep offering me this exact pattern?" That question creates distance. It breaks the automatic spell. Instead of falling into the reaction, you begin studying it. And once you study a pattern, you weaken its control. You may notice that your mind has certain favorite roads. Maybe it runs toward self-criticism the moment something goes wrong. Maybe it runs toward rejection whenever people become quiet. Maybe it runs toward fear every time life becomes uncertain. Maybe it runs toward comparison the moment you see someone else doing well. The specific content matters, but the larger truth matters more. Your mind has habits, and those habits are shaping your days far more than random events are. That can feel discouraging at first, but it is actually hopeful because habits can be interrupted, patterns can be retrained, what was learned can be challenged, what was repeated can be replaced. The mistake is waiting for the old pattern to disappear before you begin changing your life. It will not disappear first. It will show up while you change. The work is not to make sure the old thought never returns. The work is to stop obeying it automatically when it does. So when you catch a familiar thought, do not just argue with its content. Recognize its history. This is that old fear again. This is the same script. This is my mind taking the old road. That moment matters, because now you are no longer trapped inside the program. You are watching it run, and once you are watching it, you are already less controlled by it than before. You are not weak because your mind repeats old thoughts. You are only stuck if you keep calling repetition truth. The real power begins when you stop saying, "This is just how I think," and start saying, "This is what my mind has been trained to repeat." That is a very different sentence, and it opens a very different future. Because once a pattern is seen as a pattern, it can be interrupted. And once it can be interrupted, your life is no longer being shaped only by the past. And once you understand that, another truth becomes impossible to ignore. What your mind keeps repeating does not stay inside your mind for long. 3. The thoughts you repeat become your reality. Your life does not change only through the big decisions you make once in a while. It changes through the thoughts you keep rehearsing in private, because a repeated thought is never just a sentence in the mind for very long. It becomes a feeling, then a posture, then a way of speaking, then a way of acting. And after enough repetition, it stops feeling like something you are doing and starts feeling like the kind of life you were simply given. That is why two people can stand inside the same week, the same setback, the same delay, the same uncertainty, and move in completely different directions from it. One mind keeps saying, "This is hard, but I can deal with it," and the body stays available, the attention stays open, and the next action remains possible. The other mind keeps saying, "This always happens to me, I'm already behind, this is going to get worse," and before the outer situation has even fully unfolded, the inner world has already turned against itself. This is how thought becomes reality. Not in some magical way, and not because every thought instantly manifests, but because repeated thinking quietly trains your emotions, and your emotions shape your behavior. And your behavior keeps confirming the world you have been mentally rehearsing. A person who keeps repeating defeat moves differently. A person who keeps repeating fear hesitates earlier. A person who keeps repeating limitation notices fewer openings, takes fewer risks, speaks with less conviction, and then calls the outcome proof that the thought was right all along. That cycle is what makes repeated thought so dangerous. It does not only influence how you feel, it starts selecting what you notice, what you expect, what you attempt, and what you avoid. Over time, you begin living inside an emotional architecture built by repetition. If the repeated thought is small, suspicious, ashamed, or hopeless, your life will begin shrinking around it, even if no one outside you can fully see why. Think about what happens when a single thought is allowed to return unchecked for months or years. "I'm not disciplined. People don't really care. I always ruin momentum. Nothing ever changes for me." At first, these look like opinions. Then they become assumptions. Then they become instructions. And once they become instructions, they start directing the choices that build your days. You stop early. You second-guess yourself. You withdraw too fast. You expect disappointment before life has spoken. Then the results come back weak, and the mind says, "See, I told you." But the thought did not predict reality. It helped create it. The same is true in the other direction, although people often misunderstand this and turn it into shallow positivity. Repeated thought does not need to be dramatic to be powerful. It does not have to sound like a motivational speech. In fact, the most life-changing thoughts are usually simple, grounded, and believable enough to survive a bad day. I can pause before I spiral. This feeling is temporary. I do not need to turn one mistake into an identity. I can return to the next right action. These thoughts do not deny difficulty. They direct you through it. And because they direct you through it, they begin changing what your days actually look like. This is why your inner language matters so much. The voice in your head is not background noise. It is rehearsal. If that voice keeps rehearsing collapse, humiliation, rejection, or failure, then when real pressure comes, your system will already know exactly which road to take. But if that voice has been trained towards steadiness, perspective, and correction, then pressure will meet a different mind altogether. You can see this in ordinary moments. Someone who repeats thoughts of helplessness walks into a problem already deflated. Someone who repeats thoughts of clarity and responsibility walks into the same problem, looking for the next move. The circumstance may be identical, but the lived reality is not, because the mind has already shaped the relationship to it. That should make you more careful with what you repeat casually, not paranoid, not artificial, just honest. Many people speak to themselves in ways they would never speak to another human being, then wonder why their energy is low and their future feels narrow. But the mind listens. It records tone. It remembers direction. And what it hears often, it begins to trust. So if you want to change your life, you cannot ignore the thoughts you are practicing every day. You have to ask yourself what kind of emotional life they are building, what kind of actions they are encouraging, and what kind of future they are slowly making more likely. Because a repeated thought is never only a thought. It is a seed, and whether it grows into strength or fear depends on how often you water it and how long you let it live in you unchallenged. This is not about becoming fake, it is about becoming intentional. You stop repeating thoughts that weaken your posture toward life, and you begin strengthening thoughts that leave you more honest, more stable, and more able to act. That is where real change starts, not with one perfect insight, but with repeated inner direction strong enough to create different behavior. Your repeated thoughts are teaching your life what shape to take, so listen carefully to what you keep saying inside. Because if you keep repeating the same mind, you keep repeating the same life. And that naturally raises the next question. If thoughts can shape your life so deeply, can the mind itself actually change? 4. Neuroplasticity means you can rewire your mind. What makes this subject so hopeful is that your mind is not a prison built out of stone. It is more like a path through a field. The more often you walk one direction, the clearer that path becomes, the easier it feels, and the more automatic it gets. But that also means something important. A path can weaken when it is no longer used, and a new one can become real when you walk it often enough. That is the practical meaning of neuroplasticity. Your brain is not fixed in the way your fear wants you to believe. It is shaped by repetition, and because it is shaped by repetition, change is not only possible, change is trainable. This matters because many people secretly live as if their mental life is final. They talk as if their anxiety is permanent, their self-doubt is permanent, their way of reacting is permanent, their tendency to overthink is permanent. And once the mind accepts that kind of conclusion, effort immediately becomes weaker. Why try to change what you believe is built into you? Why train a mind you have already mistaken for fate? That belief alone keeps people stuck longer than the pattern itself. But the mind is constantly adapting. Every repeated thought, every repeated emotional response, every repeated habit of attention is teaching the brain what to strengthen. If you keep rehearsing fear, the brain gets faster at fear. If you keep rehearsing comparison, it gets faster at comparison. If you keep rehearsing calm interruption, perspective, and redirection, it gets better at those too. The brain does not only respond to crisis, it responds to practice. That is why you should never underestimate the effect of small mental repetitions. A person does not wake up one morning with a completely different life because of one dramatic insight. More often, the change begins when certain inner movements are repeated so consistently that the old way starts losing its grip. You catch the same anxious thought earlier than before. You refuse to feed the same spiral one more time. You return your attention instead of letting it wander into the same dark place. In the moment, it feels small. In the nervous system, it is training. This is also why people become discouraged too early. They interrupt an old pattern a few times, then feel disappointed when it still comes back, as if the return of the old thought means nothing is changing. But that is not how rewiring works. The old path remains easier for a while because it has been walked longer. The new path feels weak at first because it is new. You do not judge the new path by how natural it feels in the beginning. You judge it by whether you keep using it. Rewiring is not instant relief. It is repeated redirection. Think about what that means for your daily life. Every time you notice yourself entering a familiar loop and pause instead of feeding it, you are doing more than having a good moment. You are weakening one circuit and strengthening another. Every time you replace harsh inner talk with cleaner, steadier language, you are not merely being nice to yourself. You are changing the emotional conditions your brain is being trained under. Every time you return to focus after distraction, you are not simply trying harder. You are teaching attention where home is. This is why repetition matters more than intensity. Intense efforts feel exciting, but the brain changes most reliably through consistency. One grand mental breakthrough followed by 7 days of old habits will not do what quiet daily practice can do. The brain trusts what repeats. It builds around what repeats, and eventually it begins offering back to you the very patterns you practiced often enough to make familiar. There is something humbling in this, but also liberating. It means your current mental tendencies are not random. They were trained, even if unconsciously. And if they were trained, they can be retrained. Not with fantasy, not with slogans, with patient repetition, with enough awareness to catch the old route, and enough discipline to keep choosing a better one before the old route becomes your whole day again. This changes how you should speak to yourself during the process. Instead of saying, "Why am I still like this?" you begin saying, "My brain is still returning to the older pattern because it knows that path better right now." That is a very different response. It removes shame and keeps responsibility. It lets you stay in the work instead of turning the work itself into another reason to attack yourself. And this is the deeper reason hope matters here. Not vague hope, but grounded hope. If the mind were fixed, effort would be torture. But because the brain is responsive, every clean repetition matters. Every redirected thought matters. Every quiet act of self-command matters. You are never only trying, you are training. So when the old thought returns, do not panic and do not dramatize it. See it for what it is, a well-used road. Then calmly choose the new one again. That is how rewiring happens. Not once, not perfectly, but enough times that the mind stops assuming the old way is the only way available. Your brain is always learning from what you repeat, so teach it carefully, because the more often you practice fear, the more natural fear becomes. And the more often you practice steadiness, selection, and interruption, the more natural freedom becomes. But even with that hope, one challenge remains. Much of what shapes your life is still happening automatically. 5. Automatic thought patterns are quietly running your life. You do not wake up each morning and consciously decide to compare yourself to other people, expect the worst, replay old conversations, doubt your ability, imagine rejection, or speak to yourself with quiet contempt. And yet those patterns can shape the entire emotional tone of your day before breakfast if they have been repeated often enough to become automatic. That is what makes them dangerous. They do not arrive like dramatic breakdowns. They arrive like normal thinking. A person checks a phone and feels behind within seconds. Another hears a short reply and instantly assumes distance. Someone makes a small mistake, and before the event is even over, the mind has already turned it into evidence of a larger flaw. None of this feels programmed in the moment. It feels immediate, almost reasonable, but automatic patterns always feel reasonable while they are running. That is part of their power. They wear the face of common sense while quietly dragging your life in the same direction again and again. This is why so much mental suffering feels mysterious to people. They say they want peace, but their mind is constantly feeding itself worry. They say they want confidence, but their inner dialogue is built on suspicion and self-judgment. They say they want a different life, but the same thought patterns keep producing the same emotions, and those emotions keep producing the same behavior. The outer life changes slowly because the inner machinery is still repeating yesterday. Automatic patterns usually hide inside ordinary thoughts. I should be further along by now. People always lose interest. If I do this wrong, everything gets worse. Something feels off, so something must be wrong. Why am I like this? These sentences may look small, but repeated often enough they become lenses, and once a lens is installed, you stop noticing it. You think you are seeing life clearly when in fact you are seeing life through a pattern that keeps selecting the same kind of evidence. That selection changes everything. If your mind is trained toward threat, it keeps finding reasons to brace. If it is trained toward inadequacy, it keeps collecting proof that you are not enough. If it is trained toward comparison, every other person becomes a measuring stick. If it is trained toward victim thinking, responsibility begins to feel insulting and helplessness begins to feel honest. The pattern does not merely react to life. It organizes what life means. And because these patterns run quietly, people often mistake them for personality. They say, "I'm just an overthinker," or "I've always been hard on myself," or "This is just how my mind works," without realizing that what feels like personality is often practice. Repeated mental practice, but practice all the same. That is good news, even if it does not feel like it at first, because practice can be interrupted. The first step is not changing everything. It is learning to recognize the recurring categories of your own automatic mind. Not every thought deserves a full investigation, but certain patterns absolutely do. Worry is one. Comparison is another. Quiet self-attack is another. Imagining the worst before anything has happened. Mentally shrinking yourself before the room has even responded. Building a whole emotional state out of one small trigger. These are not random events. These are systems, and systems keep producing outcomes until they are disrupted. What makes disruption difficult is speed. Automatic thoughts move fast. They do not ask for permission. They appear, link themselves to emotion, and try to establish a mood before your wiser mind has fully entered the room. That is why catching them later feels so hard. Once the mood is strong, the pattern feels more convincing. Once the body is involved, the thought feels more true. Once the day is shaped around it, it starts feeling inevitable. But the pattern was strongest at the beginning, not because it had the most truth, but because it had the most momentum. This is why awareness has to become quicker and more practical. You are not waiting for a full collapse before noticing the script. You are training yourself to recognize the opening move, the first comparison, the first fearful exaggeration, the first harsh sentence, the first familiar assumption. That early moment matters more than people think, because once you see the opening move, you are no longer being run entirely on autopilot. And notice that the goal is not to become mentally stiff or obsessive. The goal is not to monitor every thought until you are exhausted by your own self-awareness. The goal is simpler than that. You want to know your main patterns well enough that when one of them enters the room, it no longer gets to pretend it is a stranger. You recognize its tone. You know its timing. You know what kind of day it is trying to build. And recognition alone weakens a surprising amount of its power. A person who does not recognize the pattern keeps saying, "Why does this always happen to me?" A person who has started waking up says, "I know this pattern." This is the one that turns uncertainty into fear. This is the one that turns one mistake into identity. This is the one that makes me feel behind before I have even begun. That shift may sound small, but it changes your position completely. You are no longer trapped inside the machinery. You are standing beside it, seeing what it does. And once you can see what it does, you stop respecting it so blindly. That matters because automatic thought patterns do not need your belief to appear, but they do need your continued attention to keep expanding. If you feed them without noticing, they keep growing roots through the whole day. If you catch them and refuse to help them multiply, they begin losing the authority they once had over your mood, your choices, and your identity. So start there. Learn your recurring patterns by name, not in theory, but in real life. Which thought patterns wake up when you are tired? Which ones arrive when you feel exposed? Which ones show up after comparison, after conflict, after silence, after uncertainty, after one small mistake? Study those. Those are the thoughts that have been quietly running more of your life than they should. Because what runs automatically will keep shaping you automatically until you become conscious enough to interrupt it. And that is exactly where we go next. Because once you begin seeing the old pattern, one skill becomes more important than all the rest. 6. You must learn to interrupt the old pattern early. The problem with most destructive thoughts is not that they are unstoppable, it is that they are allowed to grow for too long before you challenge them. In the beginning, the pattern is usually small, a sentence, a feeling, a quick interpretation, something subtle enough to ignore. But that early moment is exactly where your power lives, because once the thought gathers emotion, links itself to memory, and starts building a story around itself, it becomes much harder to stop. What could have been interrupted in 10 seconds now takes 10 hours to recover from. This is why timing matters so much. A spiral rarely begins as a spiral. It begins as a spark. You read a message the wrong way. You remember one mistake, and the mind starts expanding it. You feel slightly uncertain, and the mind immediately rushes to fill that uncertainty with fear. At first, it is only an opening move, but if you do not catch it there, the mind keeps building. One thought becomes 5, 5 become a mood. The mood starts affecting your body starts affecting your behavior, and soon you are no longer just having a thought, you are living inside a state. Most people try to regain control too late. They wait until the emotion is already heavy, until the day already feels ruined, until their mind has already built a full argument for why they are stuck, rejected, behind, or failing. Then they wonder why it feels so hard to come back. But by then, they are not only dealing with the original thought, they are dealing with the whole structure that was built on top of it. That is why interruption has to happen closer to the beginning. The earlier you catch the pattern, the less authority it has. A fearful thought is easiest to interrupt before it becomes fear in the body. A shame-based thought is easiest to interrupt before it becomes identity. A negative interpretation is easiest to interrupt before it starts recruiting evidence from your past. Early interruption is not a small skill. It is the difference between directing your inner world and constantly cleaning up after it. This requires a different kind of awareness than most people are used to. Not slow reflection after the damage is done, but quick recognition in the middle of life. You notice the first exaggeration, the first harsh sentence, the first inner movement toward collapse. You hear the mind saying, "Here we go again," and instead of following it out of habit, you stop the motion right there, not dramatically, just firmly. That interruption might sound like this: "No, not this road," or "This is the beginning of the old pattern," or "I do not know enough yet to think this way," or even "Pause." What matters is not the exact sentence. What matters is that you break the automatic continuation. You stop the mind from turning one impression into a whole emotional reality. This is where people often make a mistake. They think interruption means arguing with the thought endlessly, trying to defeat it with perfect logic. But that can become another trap. You do not need to debate every thought into exhaustion. Sometimes the most powerful interruption is short, clean, decisive, a refusal to keep feeding the thing that is trying to grow. Then comes the second half of interruption, which many people forget. You must redirect. If you stop the old pattern, but leave your attention in the same place, the mind will often restart the loop. So once you interrupt, You move, back to the body, back to the breath, back to the task in front of you, back to one grounded fact, back to the next right action. Interruption without redirection creates a gap. Interruption with redirection creates a path. Think about how different a day becomes when you do this early. A doubtful thought appears, but instead of letting it become a whole identity, you catch it and return to work. A fearful assumption appears, but instead of letting it poison the whole evening, you stop it before it becomes a mood. A wave of self-judgment begins rising, but you recognize it as the old pattern and refuse to let it speak for the whole of you. These moments look small from the outside. Inside the mind, they are everything. This is how self-command is built, not in grand speeches, not in perfectly calm mornings. In the instant where the old pattern starts moving and you decide not to go with it, again and again, until the interruption becomes more natural than the collapse. And that is the deeper truth here. Early interruption is not only about preventing pain, it is about training identity. Every time you catch the old pattern before it takes over, you teach yourself something powerful. I am not helpless in the face of my own mind. That lesson matters. It changes posture. It changes confidence. It changes what kind of future feels possible. So do not wait until the thought has become the whole day. Do not wait until the mood feels undeniable. Do not wait until the pattern has already dragged you back into the same inner room. Catch it early, name it early, refuse it early, redirect early. Because the first few seconds of a mental pattern often decide whether you lose your center or keep it. And once you start learning that timing, you begin understanding the next truth more deeply, because real mental power does not come from fighting every thought that appears. It comes from knowing what deserves your attention and what does not. 7. Thought control is not suppression. It is selection. A lot of people make their minds harder to heal because they approach thought like war. A dark thought appears, an insecure thought appears, an angry thought appears, and they immediately try to crush it, force it out, or punish themselves for having it. But the mind does not become clearer when you turn every inner disturbance into a fight. In fact, fighting a thought too hard often gives it more attention, more energy, and more emotional weight than it had when it first arrived. That is why real thought control is not suppression, it is selection. Suppression says, I must not think this. Selection says, I do not have to follow this. That difference changes everything, because the moment you stop treating every thought like an enemy that must be destroyed, you become calmer, more precise, and more powerful with your attention. You stop wasting strength wrestling with mental noise, and you start deciding what actually deserves a place in your inner life. Not every thought deserves a chair at the table. Not every fear deserves discussion. Not every insecurity deserves analysis. Not every impulse deserves expression. That is what selection means. It means you finally understand that the mind produces material constantly, but your freedom lies in what you feed, what you question, what you repeat, and what you let pass without building a home for it. Think about how much suffering comes from giving full attention to thoughts that never earned it. A flash of comparison becomes 10 minutes of self-doubt. A moment of fear becomes a story about the future. A harsh inner sentence becomes a whole mood. None of these thoughts began with real authority. They gained authority because they were entertained too long. They were invited in, listened to, and given space to multiply. Selection interrupts that process early. When a thought appears, you do not ask only whether it is loud or emotionally charged. You ask whether it is useful, whether it is true enough to act on, whether it leads toward clarity or confusion, whether it strengthens your direction or weakens it. And sometimes the answer is immediate. This thought is not helping, not guiding, not protecting, not clarifying. It is only draining. Once you see that, The wise response is not a dramatic internal battle. It is a quiet refusal to keep participating. This is why mature inner discipline often looks less intense than people expect. It is not a person straining all day to stay positive. It is a person becoming more selective with mental attention, less available to old fear, less available to self-attack, less available to exaggerated stories, less available to unnecessary interpretation, more available to what is solid, clean, and useful. That shift creates enormous relief, because one of the most exhausting things in life is giving serious attention to thoughts that should have remained passing weather. Selection reduces mental traffic. It teaches the mind that appearance does not equal importance. A thought can appear and still be ignored. It can knock and still not be welcomed. It can create a little noise without being allowed to redesign the whole day. This is especially important with intrusive or repetitive thoughts. Many people panic when certain thoughts return, as if the return itself means something is wrong with them. But a thought returning does not make it meaningful. It may only mean the mind is used to visiting that road. Selection helps you stop over-respecting repetition. You stop saying, "This must matter because it came back," and start saying, "This came back because it has been repeated before, and I do not have to repeat it again now." There is real peace in that. You begin to understand that control does not mean controlling what appears first. It means controlling what gets extended time, emotional investment, and inner loyalty. The first appearance is often habit. The second step is choice. And that second step is where your life starts changing. So if a thought helps you see clearly, keep it. If it helps you act honestly, keep it. If it brings you back to responsibility, perspective, patience, or courage, keep it. But if it only pulls you toward fear, shame, collapse, or old identity, let it pass without ceremony. You do not need to put every thought on trial. Some thoughts deserve nothing more than a closed door. That is the discipline here, becoming a careful gatekeeper of your own attention. And if this point is landing for you, take a second to like the video and write in the comments, "I choose what I feed." That one sentence is stronger than it looks, because your life is always moving in the direction of what your mind keeps feeding. And once you understand that, the next truth becomes impossible to ignore, because the voice you hear all day inside your own head is never neutral. 8. Your inner dialogue is either building you or breaking you. You can change your schedule, your goals, your habits, even the people around you. But if the voice you live with all day is still harsh, suspicious, impatient, and quietly against you, your life will keep feeling heavier than it needs to feel. Because no one influences your mood, your courage, your resilience, and your behavior more consistently than the way you speak to yourself when nobody is listening. That inner dialogue becomes dangerous because it is constant. A cruel comment from another person may hurt for an hour, but a cruel tone inside your own mind can shape an entire year. It follows you into work, into relationships, into mistakes, into quiet moments, into mornings when you are already tired. And if that voice keeps repeating that you are behind, weak, disappointing, not ready, not enough, then eventually your nervous system starts living as if those sentences are not thoughts but conditions of life. This is how people slowly shrink without noticing it. They stop taking certain risks. They stop speaking with conviction. They lower the size of what they attempt. They hesitate too early. They give up too fast. Then they call it realism, when often it is just the natural result of living under a voice that keeps cutting their strength before it has time to become action. And the hard part is that this voice often sounds familiar enough to feel honest. That is why it survives. It does not speak like an obvious enemy. It speaks like someone who is just telling the truth. It says, "I'm only being realistic. I'm only protecting you. I'm only making sure you don't embarrass yourself again." But if the result of that voice is smaller action, weaker posture, lower effort, and less hope, then whatever it calls itself, it is not helping you live well. A useful inner voice does not have to be soft or fake. It does not need to flatter you. It needs to be clear. It needs to be clean. It needs to help you recover your footing instead of taking more of it away. There is a difference between a voice that says, "That was careless, fix it," and a voice that says, "You always ruin everything." One creates correction. The other creates collapse. One keeps dignity intact. The other attacks identity. That difference matters more than people think. Your inner dialogue is setting the emotional climate in which all your decisions are made. If that climate is hostile, then even small tasks feel heavier. Discipline feels harder. Recovery takes longer. Mistakes become personal. But if the inner climate becomes steadier, more direct and less violent, then something changes in the body too. You do not waste as much energy defending yourself from your own mind. You can fail without spiraling. You can adjust without self-hatred. You can keep moving without needing to first repair the damage caused by your own internal voice. This is why self-talk is not some small motivational topic. It is architecture. It shapes the room you live in psychologically. And if the room is filled with accusation, fear, exaggeration, and contempt, you will feel mentally cornered even when life outside you is still workable. So the work here is not to become artificially positive. The work is to stop speaking to yourself in ways that make good action less likely. When you notice the old voice becoming absolute, heavy, and cruel, slow it down. Strip the drama out of it. Turn judgment into direction. Turn insult into instruction. Turn collapse into clarity. Instead of, "I'm such a failure," say, "That choice was weak. Correct it." Instead of, "I never change," say, "I slipped again. Now return." Instead of, "I can't handle this," say, "This is difficult, but I can handle the next part." That is not wordplay. That is mental leadership. Because the goal is not to feel better for 5 minutes. The goal is to build an inner voice that makes steadiness more available, especially when pressure rises. A strong life cannot be built on a voice that keeps tearing down the person trying to build it. Listen closely to how you speak to yourself after mistakes, during stress, and in quiet moments when nobody is there to interrupt the pattern. That is where the real training is. If the voice is building patience, perspective, correction, and courage, keep strengthening it. If it is feeding shame, helplessness, and old identity, it needs to lose authority. Your inner dialogue is never just talking, it is training, and whatever it keeps training in you will eventually show up in your face, your choices, your confidence, and the shape of your life. So if you want a different life, do not only watch your actions, watch the voice that is shaping them. And once you see how much that inner tone matters, the next danger becomes easier to spot. One small negative thought can become a full inner collapse if you let it gather speed. 9. Negative spirals must be broken before they gain momentum. It almost never begins with a breakdown. It begins with something small that could have stayed small if it had been caught in time. A short reply, a mistake, an awkward moment, a quiet fear, a sentence in your head that lands harder than it should. And then the mind does what it has practiced doing for years. It adds meaning, then urgency, then memory, then prediction, until one passing thought becomes a whole emotional atmosphere. And you're no longer dealing with what happened, but with everything your mind piled on top of it. That is what a negative spiral really is. Not a single thought, but a thought that was given enough time, enough attention, and enough emotional fuel to start multiplying. And once it multiplies, it changes the body first. Your breathing tightens, your chest hardens, your focus narrows. You stop seeing the whole day and start seeing only the problem. Then behavior follows. You withdraw, overreact, overthink, procrastinate, or start looking for proof that the spiral is right. By then, the original moment is already gone, but the state it created is still running you. This is why the timing matters so much. A negative spiral is weakest at the beginning, when it still looks ordinary. Once it gains momentum, it starts speaking with the voice of certainty. It says, "See, this is bigger than you thought. This always happens. This means something is wrong. This day is ruined. You are back in the same place again." And because the body is now involved, those thoughts feel more convincing than they were a few minutes earlier. The spiral becomes believable, not because it is true, but because it has gathered emotional weight. The mistake most people make is trying to solve the spiral after they have already entered it fully. They wait until they feel overwhelmed, then try to reason their way out. Sometimes that helps a little, but the real skill is earlier than that. You have to become familiar with the first turn, the first exaggeration, the first sentence that starts building a disaster out of a difficulty, the first moment where the mind leaves the facts and starts writing a darker story around them. That early moment is where your power lives. Maybe the spiral begins with self-judgment. That was embarrassing. Then it becomes, why am I always like this? Then, I never change. Then, people can probably see it too. In less than 2 minutes, the mind has moved from one event to a whole identity attack. Or maybe it begins with fear. Something feels off. Then, this could get worse. Then, I need to figure this out right now. Then, if I can't fix it, everything falls apart. The pattern is different, but the mechanism is the same. One thought is allowed to breed 5 more, and together they create a mental reality much heavier than the original moment. So the work is not only to calm down once the spiral is strong. The work is to refuse multiplication. When the first dark turn appears, you interrupt the chain before it becomes a system. You do not let one thought recruit 5 more. You bring the mind back to what is actually true, actually happening, and actually in front of you. Not the imagined future. Not the old wound it reminds you of. Not the identity conclusion it is trying to sell you. Just the real thing. This happened. I feel activated. I do not need to build a whole world around it. That sentence alone can save hours, because most spirals survive on expansion. They need you to keep going. They need you to keep explaining, predicting, comparing, and replaying. If you stop cooperating early, the spiral loses oxygen. It may not disappear instantly, but it weakens, and a weakened spiral is much easier to live through than a fed one. This is why you need an early pattern breaker that is simple enough to use under stress. It might be a sentence. It might be standing up and moving. It might be putting the phone down. It might be returning to the breath and naming only the facts. What matters is not elegance. What matters is interruption before identification becomes total. And you have to be careful here not to romanticize your intensity. Some people are so used to spiraling that calm feels passive to them. They think that if they are not mentally wrestling with the problem, they are being irresponsible. But spiraling is not depth. It is loss of control disguised as seriousness. Real seriousness brings you closer to reality. Spiraling pulls you away from it. So learn your opening moves. Learn the first tone your mind takes before the collapse begins. Learn what it sounds like when one thought is trying to become a whole inner storm. If you can catch that moment, you can stop feeding it. And if you stop feeding it often enough, the spiral stops feeling inevitable. A bad thought is not yet a bad day. A bad moment is not yet a bad identity. A trigger is not yet a collapse, but it can become all of that if you let it gather speed. Break it early, break it cleanly, break it before it starts speaking like fate. And once you stop letting thoughts multiply blindly, you start seeing another influence more clearly. The things around you are feeding your mind every single day. 10. Your mental environment is programming you every day. Look closely at what fills your mind from morning to night, and you will start to understand why certain thoughts keep returning with such force, because thought does not grow in isolation. It grows in an atmosphere. It grows in what you watch when you are tired, in what you scroll when you are lonely, in the tone of the conversations you stay inside, in the music, the noise, the headlines, the arguments, the people who normalize panic, gossip, contempt, and low attention until your inner world starts carrying the shape of whatever it keeps touching. That is why trying to control your thoughts while leaving your mental environment chaotic is like trying to calm water while someone keeps striking the surface. You may get brief moments of clarity, but they will not hold for long because the mind is always absorbing more than you realize. It records emotional tone. It records pace. It records what is repeated. And when something enters often enough, it stops feeling external. It starts sounding like your own voice. A person who lives in constant digital noise usually thinks the problem is focus. A person who is surrounded by cynical, negative, or dramatic conversations often thinks the problem is mood. A person who spends hours consuming comparison-heavy content thinks the problem is confidence. But many of these struggles are not born purely inside. They are being fed from the outside every day. The mind keeps drinking from the same source, then wonders why its inner state feels restless, doubtful, and heavy. This is the part people underestimate, because mental influence rarely looks dramatic in the moment. One video does not ruin your attention. One conversation does not rewrite your outlook. One evening of scrolling does not destroy your peace. But repetition matters. The mind adapts to what surrounds it. If you keep exposing yourself to urgency, outrage, stimulation, comparison, and emotional disorder, then calm will start feeling unnatural. Silence will feel empty. Focus will feel difficult. Stillness will feel like something is missing. That is not because peace is impossible for you. It is because your environment has been training you away from it. And the reverse is also true, which is where the hope lives. The moment your environment becomes cleaner, your mind often improves faster than you expected. Not because you solved every internal issue, but because you stopped feeding the ones that were already too strong. You notice that your thoughts soften when you are not surrounded by constant commentary. You notice that your inner tone steadies when you stop consuming content that keeps you emotionally activated. You notice that your mind becomes easier to guide when it is no longer being dragged in 10 directions before noon. This should make you more protective of what you allow near your mind, not paranoid, not rigid, just honest. If certain conversations always leave you bitter, suspicious, or drained, they are shaping you. If certain media keeps you feeling inferior, behind, or mentally scattered, it is shaping you. If your mornings begin with noise and your nights end in overstimulation, your thought life is being trained in ways that make inner discipline much harder than it needs to be. You cannot keep feeding the mind chaos and expect it to produce clarity on command. That means your mental environment must become part of your practice, not an afterthought. What do you read when your attention is weak? What do you hear while doing ordinary tasks? What kind of people get the best hours of your energy? What emotional atmosphere are you stepping into again and again without questioning its effect on you? Those questions matter because every environment comes with a hidden curriculum. It teaches you how to think, what to expect, what to fear, what to admire, what to repeat. Some environments teach haste, some teach resentment, some teach helplessness, some teach shallowness. Some quietly train you to always need more stimulation before you can tolerate your own mind. Then there are environments that do the opposite. They slow you down. They make you more present. They reduce internal noise instead of increasing it. They leave you with more room inside yourself, not less. That is the difference you need to start noticing. You do not need to become extreme to change this. You do not need to disappear from the world or live like a monk. But you do need to become intentional. Maybe that means you stop beginning the day with your phone because you're tired of letting other people's speed become your first state of mind. Maybe it means you reduce the kind of content that keeps your brain restless and dissatisfied. Maybe it means you become more selective about who gets to speak into your life when you are already mentally worn down. Maybe it means you protect certain hours of the day from noise entirely, not because silence is magical, but because your mind needs room to return to itself. That room matters more than people think. A crowded mind cannot hear itself clearly. It reacts more, chooses less, and ends up confusing external programming with personal truth. Then one day it says, "This is just how I am," when often it should be asking, "What have I been feeding my mind every day that made this feel normal?" The answer to that question changes a lot. Because once you understand that your mental environment is not neutral, you stop treating it casually. You stop acting as if every input costs the same. You begin curating your atmosphere the way a serious person protects anything valuable. Not obsessively, but deliberately. Less noise, less emotional pollution, less random access, more stillness, more clarity, more inputs that leave your mind sharper instead of heavier. And once that changes, thought control becomes easier because you are no longer fighting your mind while secretly feeding what weakens it. Your environment is not outside the process, it is part of the process. Whatever surrounds your attention long enough will eventually begin speaking from inside you. So choose carefully what gets to live around your mind, because the quality of your thoughts is being shaped every day, even when you are not actively thinking about it. And once the environment becomes cleaner, there is one more thing your mind needs in order to stop leaking so much strength. 11. Focus is how you stop leaking mental power. A scattered mind does not only feel tired, it feels divided. And once your attention is divided long enough, your life starts losing force without any obvious disaster ever taking place. Because energy is not only lost through pain, conflict, or exhaustion, but through constant mental switching, constant unfinished loops, constant exposure to things that pull you away before a thought can deepen, before a task can settle, before your mind can gather enough weight to direct anything well. That is why focus matters so much. Not because being focused looks impressive, but because attention is how you aim your life. Whatever keeps stealing it keeps shaping you. A mind that cannot stay with one thing long enough to understand it, build it, feel it, or complete it will always struggle to create depth, and without depth, life begins to feel thin. You do many things, but inhabit none of them fully. You start much, but finish little. You think all day, but resolve very little because your power is leaking through fragmentation. This is one of the quietest forms of suffering in modern life. You sit down to work, and within minutes, your mind is somewhere else. You try to think clearly, but another thought interrupts. You open one thing, then another, then another. A message, a tab, a memory, a worry, a small urge to check something, and suddenly the mind no longer belongs to the moment in front of it. It belongs to whatever pulled hardest most recently. When that becomes normal, you stop directing your attention and start renting it out in fragments. And fragments do not build a strong life. The deeper cost of scattered attention is not only lower productivity, it is weaker inner authority. Each time your mind is pulled away too easily, it learns that it does not need to stay. It learns that discomfort must be escaped quickly, that silence must be interrupted, that effort must be constantly softened with stimulation. Over time, this makes depth feel harder than it really is. It makes reading feel heavier, listening feel shorter, building feel slower, reflection feel impossible. Then people say they have lost discipline, when often what they have really lost is trained attention. Focus repairs that loss. It teaches the mind to stay, to remain with what matters long enough for understanding to deepen and for action to become meaningful. That could be a task, a conversation, a problem, a page, a walk, a feeling you need to face without escaping it. Focus is not only about work, it is about reclaiming the ability to remain present without being dragged away by every inner or outer interruption. That ability changes everything. When focus strengthens, thought becomes cleaner because fewer unnecessary thoughts are being fed. Emotion becomes steadier because attention is no longer being pulled through 10 different atmospheres in 1 hour. Decisions become better because the mind has enough continuity to actually process what is happening instead of reacting in pieces. Even your sense of self becomes quieter and more stable because a focused mind stops producing so much internal spill. This is why attention must be trained, not merely demanded. You cannot shout at a distracted mind and expect it to become calm. You train it the way you would train anything weak but capable, patiently, repeatedly, with shorter honest reps at first, and with enough discipline to return it each time it wanders. That return matters, not perfection. Return. Every time you notice the drift and come back, you are strengthening something. Every time you resist the urge to switch, check, escape, or mentally abandon the moment, you are rebuilding authority. And authority is what scattered people are missing most. Because the truth is, a scattered mind is not weak in intelligence. It is weak in direction. It has too many open doors, too many loose threads, too many voices entering at once. Focus closes some of those doors. It says, not now. It says, stay here. It says, this matters more than the next distraction. That is why focus is not harshness. It is selection with discipline behind it. You can begin noticing this in ordinary ways. Can you stay with one task without reaching for stimulation the moment it becomes slightly difficult? Can you listen to someone without your mind rushing elsewhere? Can you read without checking something after 2 paragraphs? Can you sit with one problem without escaping into 10 smaller distractions? These are not minor questions. They reveal how much of your mental power is currently leaking. And the leak adds up. A little distraction here, a little switching there, a little unfinished thinking, a little background noise, a little scattered attention. None of it looks dramatic alone, but together they produce a life that feels mentally expensive. You're always busy, yet rarely clear. Always occupied, yet rarely grounded. Always mentally active, yet strangely underpowered. Focus reverses that. It gathers the pieces. It gives your mind weight again. So do not think of focus as a productivity tool only. Think of it as protection. Protection from mental waste. Protection from self-fragmentation. Protection from living your whole life in half attention. Because once your attention begins staying where you place it, your thoughts stop scattering your strength, your actions become cleaner, and your life starts moving with more force and less noise. And that brings us to the final truth, because none of this changes through one good day or one strong insight alone. 12. A new life begins with new mental habits. People often wait for one powerful realization to change everything, as if a single insight, a single breakthrough, or a single emotional moment will suddenly free them from years of old thinking. But real change rarely works like that. Because the mind is shaped less by what moves you once and more by what trains you daily. And if the same thoughts keep being repeated in the same order, under the same conditions, with the same loyalty, then life keeps taking the same shape, no matter how inspired you felt last night. That is why a new life does not begin when you understand the truth once. It begins when you start living with new mental habits long enough that they stop feeling like effort and start feeling like your new baseline. A person does not become mentally strong because they had one clear day. They become mentally strong because they kept returning to clearer thinking on ordinary days, tired days, distracted days, and days when the old pattern still knocked on the door. This is what people miss when they say they want change. They want a new life, but they still rehearse the same thoughts every morning. They still narrate setbacks the same way. They still speak to themselves with the same tone. They still let the same triggers lead them into the same inner room. Then they wonder why nothing holds. But nothing holds because nothing is being trained consistently enough to replace what is already automatic. Mental habits are built in very small moments. The moment you pause before believing a thought. The moment you redirect instead of spiraling. The moment you choose a cleaner sentence in your inner dialogue. The moment you stop feeding comparison. The moment you come back to the present instead of letting fear write the future for you. These moments do not look dramatic, but they are how the mind changes shape. Over time, those repetitions become identity. You no longer have to fight so hard to stay grounded because grounding has been practiced. You no longer have to force perspective because perspective has been rehearsed. You no longer collapse into every passing thought because you have trained a different relationship with thought itself. That is when change becomes real, not when it sounds inspiring, but when it starts happening automatically. And this is where patience matters. New mental habits often feel weak in the beginning because the old ones are still stronger, still faster, still more familiar. But familiar is not the same as true, and fast is not the same as right. If you keep repeating the new pattern calmly enough, the mind begins trusting it. It begins returning to it more easily. Then one day you notice something important. The thought that used to ruin the whole day no longer has the same force. The old spiral breaks earlier, the inner voice sounds different, and life starts feeling lighter, not because reality changed overnight, but because your mind stopped relating to reality in the old way. That is the real beginning of a new life. Not one moment of motivation, not one emotional promise, not one perfect morning. A new life begins when your daily mental habits stop serving the old version of you. So if you want change to last, stop asking only what you understand now and start asking what you are practicing every day. Because practice is what becomes pattern. Pattern is what becomes character. And character is what quietly becomes destiny. You do not need one more intense insight. You need repetition strong enough to outlive the old script. And that is where your new life starts, quietly, daily, and from the inside out. If there is one thing to carry out of this episode, let it be this. Your mind is not a place you have to fear for the rest of your life. It can be observed, trained, interrupted, redirected, and strengthened. Not perfectly, not all at once, but deliberately enough that your thoughts stop acting like rulers and start becoming something you know how to work with. You are not your thoughts. Old programming can be challenged, spirals can be stopped earlier, attention can be reclaimed, and new inner habits can build a completely different life over time. That is the deeper promise here. Not that you will never think negatively again, but that you do not have to keep living under the authority of every thought that passes through your mind. So do not leave this as an idea. Choose one pattern from this episode, just one, and start working on it in real life. Catch it earlier, name it faster, feed it less. Repeat the better pattern until it begins to feel like you. And if this episode helped you see your mind more clearly, take a second to like the video and write in the comments, "I train my mind daily."